The phrase market rate fell from Victoria Vance's lips like a drop of icy water, flat, cold, and absolute. She did not look up from the folder containing my formal salary adjustment request, which was resting on her pristine glass desk. She simply adjusted her glasses, her fingers tapping against the glossy surface with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like a ticking clock counting down the end of my career there. I had sat in that corner office many times over the last 7 years, discussing software architecture, planning database migrations, and guiding the engineering team through difficult project deadlines. But today, the room felt completely different, cold, distant, and unfamiliar. Victoria explained that these new graduates brought contemporary perspectives and updated technological skills that the modern market demanded. She added that they had been trained in the latest software development systems that I had been forced to learn on the fly during my long tenure. Hearing those words felt like a physical blow, a sudden shock that left me breathless as I sat in the leather chair. For 7 long years, I had poured my energy, my time, and my health into this company. I was employee number 6 when Victoria first started the technology consulting agency in a small, cramped office downtown. I had worked 60-hour weeks, written the entire suite of training manuals, and designed the primary software architecture that the company now relied upon for its daily operations. Now, at 32 years of age, I was listening to the founder explain why new hires with zero industry experience were starting at 50% more than my current pay rate. An administrative assistant had accidentally copied me on a compensation breakdown spreadsheet meant only for the executive board. The numbers had burned into my mind, and I could not forget the massive discrepancy. I told Victoria that I wrote the original manuals and designed the core framework. She leaned forward, her expression remaining neutral as she repeated that the market had shifted. She told me that my compensation reflected the conditions of the target market when I was first hired, rather than the current competitive landscape. She said the company valued my contributions, but reminded me that business decisions were never personal. It was the exact same justification she had offered when denying my previous 3 salary adjustment requests. I sat there, remembering the immense personal sacrifices that lay behind those 7 years of dedicated work. I had missed the wedding of my sister Clara Thorne to complete a critical database migration for our largest account, the Henderson project. I had worked through a severe case of pneumonia to meet a tight client deadline, coughing at my desk while Victoria promised that our shared sacrifices would lead to shared rewards. Now those promises felt empty. I pushed the independent salary report across the desk, showing that my pay was far below the regional average. Victoria did not even look at the documents. She told me that adjusting my current salary was not possible because the budget had already been allocated for the current fiscal year. When I suggested a promotion to reflect my expanded responsibilities, she claimed there were no open positions at the next management level. She closed the folder with a sharp snap that signaled the conversation was officially over. She said I had to accept the situation or seek other employment. The cold finality of her words left me stunned. 7 years of dedicated service had been reduced to a simple, dismissive ultimatum during a 10-minute meeting. I stood up on unstable legs and told her I needed the weekend to consider my options. Victoria did not look up as she reached for her ringing telephone. She told me to have my final decision ready by 9 o'clock on Monday morning when the next product planning meeting was scheduled. I walked out of the executive suite, passing the rows of bright cubicles where the newly hired employees were chatting and drinking coffee. Their light-hearted conversation felt like an insult as I made my way to the elevator. I went into the restroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I saw a tired woman with dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back hastily. My blouse was wrinkled because I had not found the time to do laundry during the busy week. The realization of how much I had sacrificed for a company that valued me so little was painful. That evening, as I sat in my small apartment, I opened my personal computer and began searching through my archive of old emails from Victoria. I was looking for patterns of communication, but I found something far more significant that changed my entire approach. The archive was filled with hundreds of messages from Victoria, asking me to work late, to handle client emergencies, and to manage the workloads of others who had resigned. For years, I had accepted these requests without complaint, believing that my dedication would be rewarded. But as I read through the old threads, the contrast between her promises and her actual decisions became clear. She had built her company on the backs of employees who were willing to sacrifice their personal lives for the dream of future success. While she bought a luxury vehicle and a second home, my salary had barely kept pace with inflation. I felt a deep sense of anger, but also a new clarity. I realized that my loyalty had been treated as a vulnerability. I decided that I would no longer allow myself to be undervalued. I would use the weekend to plan my departure, but I would not leave quietly. I spent the late hours of Friday evening analyzing the company's financial growth over the past 7 years. I reviewed public records, press releases, and industry publications, mapping our corporate expansion against my frozen salary. When I joined the agency, our annual revenue was less than $500,000. Today, it exceeded $12 million. We had grown from a tiny team of 6 enthusiastic engineers to an enterprise of more than 200 employees across 3 regional offices. The engineering practices I established had allowed the company to scale without major technical debt. Yet, while Victoria boasted of our exponential revenue growth at conferences, my compensation remained stagnant. This comparison reinforced my decision to demand a fair resolution. I would not allow my work to be ignored. The message that changed everything was dated 3 years ago, sent from Victoria to the Chief Financial Officer, Raymond Fletcher. She had written that my compensation should remain at the current level because I was too valuable in my technical role to promote. She added that I was unlikely to leave the firm because I was emotionally invested in the company's story, meaning my personal attachment made the sunk cost of leaving too high. She instructed Raymond to apply only the standard 2% annual cost of living adjustment. Reading those words felt like seeing the mechanics of my own exploitation. They had intentionally kept my compensation low because they knew I cared about the work and the team. My loyalty was not valued. It was used as a tool to save money. The realization was bitter, but it gave me a sense of purpose. The shock faded, replaced by a cold and focused determination. I realized I was not the only employee who had been treated this way. I called my close friend Dominic, an experienced human resources director at another technology firm. When I explained the situation and read the email to him, he was quiet for a moment. He told me that this was a classic example of wage suppression and warned me that it might be happening to other senior staff members. He explained that companies often exploit long-term employees because they assume they are comfortable and afraid of change. Dominic explained that this was a short-sighted strategy that often led to high turnover when the truth was discovered. He asked if I had access to the broader compensation database. I told him that I did not have direct access, but I knew the person who managed the network security. Dominic detailed how companies track employee behavior to determine who is least likely to leave. He explained that they look at factors such as home ownership, length of commute, and family stability to build profiles of low-risk employees. These profiles allow HR departments to target specific individuals for wage suppression. Knowing that the cost of moving for these employees is higher than the average worker, he advised me that sharing salary information is a protected right under federal law, and that compiling evidence was the first step toward correcting the imbalance. His professional guidance gave me the confidence I needed to proceed. I realized that my situation was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic corporate practice. Preston had been our information technology director for nearly 5 years. He and I had worked together closely when the firm upgraded its central database. When his assistant resigned in the middle of that project, I had volunteered to help him run cables and configure servers during the weekend. I called Preston and asked him if he would meet me for a conversation outside of work. He heard the tension in my voice and suggested meeting at a quiet tavern called Barlow's, located several miles away from the office. When I arrived, the tavern was dark and nearly empty, with only a few patrons sitting at the bar. Preston was sitting in a booth in the corner, holding a glass of soda. I sat down and handed him a printed copy of the email from Victoria to Raymond Fletcher. Preston read the message twice, his face growing serious under the dim lights of the tavern. He muttered that it was a terrible way to treat someone who had built the company. I told him that I believed Victoria and Raymond were doing this to all the senior staff members to keep costs low. I explained that I needed to see the salary data for every employee who had been with the company for more than 2 years. Preston stared at me, his fingers tapping the glass. He warned me that accessing such files was a serious violation of company policy and could lead to termination. I argued that using emotional manipulation to suppress wages was also a violation of basic ethics. I told him that I did not want him to break the law, but asked if there was a way to view the data safely without risking his job. Preston recalled his own challenges with Victoria. He explained that he had requested a budget upgrade for our network security firewalls 6 months ago, warning her of potential vulnerabilities. Victoria had denied the request, citing tight budgets, only to purchase a new electric vehicle for herself the following week. He expressed concern about his pension and his family, but he was tired of seeing dedicated colleagues being exploited. He agreed to help me. He explained that he ran weekly security audits of the payroll database. He said that he occasionally saved the draft reports in a shared network folder for testing purposes before moving them to the secure server. He looked at me and said that the folder was accessible to senior engineers for the next 12 hours. By Sunday morning, I had downloaded the report and compiled the data into a spreadsheet. The reality was worse than I had feared. Every single employee who had been with the agency for more than 3 years was paid significantly below the average market rate, with some earning 40% less than new hires in equivalent positions. I spent the rest of the day analyzing the numbers and preparing a detailed document that showed the systematic pattern of underpayment. The data was clear and undeniable. I knew that I held the key to exposing a massive injustice that affected dozens of people. I spent the evening preparing my final plan. The data showed that the longest-serving employees were the most underpaid. The executives had deliberately brought in new graduates at premium rates while freezing the salaries of the veteran engineers who trained them. I also found email threads between Victoria and the executive board discussing what they termed retention cost management. They had analyzed employee profiles to identify those with high loyalty scores. These were individuals who rarely complained, had families in the area, or had expressed deep attachment to the company. The board had systematically decided to keep their salary adjustments to a minimum, betting that their fear of change would prevent them from resigning. It was a calculated strategy of exploitation that targeted the very people who kept the company running. My hands were trembling as I organized the spreadsheet. This was no longer just about my own salary. It was about dozens of colleagues who were being systematically underpaid while they worked long hours to keep the business profitable. I had to choose my next step. I could simply use the market data to find another job and leave the company behind. Or I could take action that would force the leadership to address the injustice. I decided to act on behalf of everyone. I spent the rest of Sunday preparing my resignation document like a document and writing a detailed message. The email was addressed to the 47 employees who had been with the firm for more than 2 years, including the senior developers, project managers, and quality assurance analysts. In my analysis, I categorized the data by department and experience level to present a clear picture of the disparity. The spreadsheet had columns for current salary, years of service, market average, and the percentage difference. It revealed that senior developers with 7 years of experience were earning $20,000 less than the new graduates we had hired just last month. I also highlighted the company's financial growth during this period, showing that executive compensation had increased by over 80% while staff salaries had remained stagnant. This clear visual presentation made the exploitation impossible to deny. I wanted my colleagues to understand the full extent of the suppression. I worked through the weekend, barely sleeping as I verified each entry against current market statistics from independent human resources consultancies. I wanted to ensure that every calculation was flawless and that no executive could challenge the validity of the findings. The parameters the management used to calculate the loyalty index were detailed in the report. They tracked factors such as how many times an employee had worked during holidays, how often they accepted overtime without requesting additional pay, and whether they had local financial commitments like home mortgages. I was shocked to find my name at the very top of the list, marked with a flag indicating a 95% retention probability and labeled as low risk of attrition. Seeing my dedication converted into a metric for wage suppression was the final straw. I realized that my silence would only allow this system to continue. The subject line of the email read, "The truth about our compensation structure and retention strategy." Inside, I explained the findings of my analysis and attached a summary of the wage discrepancies. I did not include individual names to protect privacy, but I showed the clear patterns of wage suppression based on tenure. I also included a copy of the email Victoria had written about my compensation, proving that the suppression was intentional. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a cold wind. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, dressed in a professional suit, and drove to the office. The security guard, Walter, looked surprised when I scanned my security badge at 5:15 in the morning. He asked if I had a big presentation scheduled for the morning. I smiled and replied that it was indeed a very important day. The office was quiet and dark, the empty desks looking like silent sentinels. I walked to the executive suite and entered Victoria's office. I placed a sealed envelope directly on her chair so that she would have to pick it up before sitting down. Inside the envelope was my resignation letter, a copy of her internal email regarding my salary, and a storage drive containing the complete compensation audit. After leaving the envelope, I returned to my desk, opened my laptop, and navigated to the draft email I had prepared. I wanted to make sure everything was in order before taking the final step. I looked at the send button for a long moment, knowing that pressing it would destroy my career at this company. I thought about the 7 years of dedication, the missed family events, and Victoria's cold face during our meeting. I pressed the button. The email was sent to 47 people simultaneously. I closed my laptop, packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box, and carried it to my car. By 6:30 in the morning, I was sitting in a coffee shop down the street, watching the office building. I knew Victoria always arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning. At exactly 7:15, my mobile phone began to ring with her name on the screen. I let it ring, watching the building as the first employees began to arrive. I declined the first call. It rang again immediately, and I declined it a second time. Then a text message arrived from Victoria, demanding that I call her immediately to explain my actions. I did not reply. The inbox of my personal email account was already filling with messages from my colleagues. Eleanor from marketing wrote to ask if the data was authentic. Diana from the product team sent a message saying she had suspected a discrepancy when she learned a new hire was earning $30,000 more than her for the same work. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Victoria called again. This time, I answered the phone with a calm voice, prepared for her reaction. Victoria was furious, her voice shaking as she accused me of corporate espionage and threatened to file a lawsuit immediately. I remained quiet until she finished speaking. I told her that I had consulted with legal experts and knew my rights. I explained that under Section 8, subsection A, paragraph 1 of the National Labor Relations Act, employees have a protected right to share and discuss wage information. I added that my email to the staff was a protected concerted activity under federal law. Furthermore, I explained that under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, Title 18, Section 1833 of the United States Code, I had whistleblower immunity because I was disclosing evidence of systematic wage suppression to address an ongoing violation of policy. I was confident in my position. I also pointed out that as the majority shareholder, her deliberate suppression of staff wages had created a severe operational risk that could result in the loss of major clients. I explained that this was a breach of her fiduciary duty to the company's investors, and the board of directors would hold her personally liable if the company imploded. Victoria was silent on the other end of the line, her breathing heavy. I suggested that we meet in person to discuss a resolution that would protect the firm and its employees. I told her to meet me at a coffee shop called the Cardinal at 9:30 in the morning. She agreed and hung up the phone. I knew she had no choice but to negotiate. During the call, I could hear the background noise of the office, where employees were already discussing the email in the hallways and break rooms. The atmosphere was tense, and Victoria was clearly panicked by the rapid spread of the information. I kept my tone professional and calm, refusing to respond to her emotional outbursts. This approach helped me maintain control of the conversation. I knew that she was trying to intimidate me, but the legal framework I presented made it clear that I had the upper hand. I was prepared to defend my actions in court if necessary, but I hoped to resolve the issue without further conflict. I arrived at the coffee shop early and selected a table in the back corner where we could speak without being overheard. Victoria walked in a few minutes later, her expression tense. She sat down across from me, her knuckles white, as she gripped her purse. She accused me of destroying the company culture and causing mass panic among the staff. I replied that the culture had already been damaged by her dishonest compensation practices. I told her that telling employees they are valued, while intentionally keeping them underpaid, was the real cause of the crisis. I placed a folder on the table between us. Inside was a proposed compensation adjustment plan that I had drafted. The plan required the company to bring every employee's salary up to the current market rate within 30 days. It also included back pay for the long-term employees who had been underpaid for years. Finally, it demanded a new policy of salary transparency for all future hires. Victoria stared at the folder, protesting that implementing such adjustments would bankrupt the business. I showed her the financial projections I had created, demonstrating that the company could afford the changes by reducing executive bonuses for 2 quarters. I told her she had 24 hours to accept the plan, or I would deliver the complete data set to the Department of Labor, the major investors, and the regional press. She looked at the documents, her anger turning to resignation. Victoria attempted to argue that our profit margins were too thin to support such a massive increase in payroll. She claimed that the board of directors would reject the plan immediately. I countered by showing her that the cost of replacing even 5 senior engineers would exceed the total cost of the salary adjustments. I pointed out that the loss of institutional knowledge would damage our ability to deliver projects on time, leading to contract cancellations and legal penalties. I reminded her that our recent Series B funding round had provided several $1 million in reserve capital, which was more than enough to cover the transition. She had no logical counterargument. Victoria grabbed the folder and left the coffee shop without another word. I returned to my apartment and waited for the reaction. By noon, I received a text from Preston saying that Victoria had called an emergency meeting for the entire staff. During the meeting, she had announced that the company was conducting an immediate review of its payroll structure to address inconsistencies. She promised that salary adjustments would be made by the end of the week. That evening, the company legal team sent me an agreement offering 6 months of salary as a separation package in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. I declined the offer immediately, refusing to be silenced. I wanted to ensure that the truth remained public. Over the next week, 12 senior employees resigned from the firm, having secured positions at other agencies that offered fair market pay. The loss of these key engineers created immediate problems. The firm was unable to support the Henderson account, and the client canceled their contract the following week. 1 month later, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. They forced Victoria to step down from her role as chief executive officer, citing her breach of fiduciary duty and the mismanagement of employee retention. The board appointed the chief operating officer, Nicholas, as the interim leader to rebuild the organization. He immediately began working to repair the damage Victoria had caused. 6 weeks after my resignation, Nicholas sent me an email offering me the position of Director of Product Strategy. The offer came with a salary that was double my previous pay. He wrote that the company had implemented all the changes I had proposed, including complete wage transparency and market rate adjustments. He asked me to return to help them rebuild the firm on a foundation of fairness. I was tempted by the offer, but I realized that some relationships cannot be restored. I declined the position and suggested they promote Theodora, a talented developer who had been overlooked for years. Nicholas accepted the recommendation and promoted her the next day. I felt a sense of satisfaction. I accepted a senior architect position at a different technology firm that offered appropriate compensation from the start. But my journey did not end there. I began sharing my story on professional networks, and the response was overwhelming. Strangers from various industries wrote to tell me they were facing similar wage suppression. I helped a group of employees at a financial firm, led by a woman named Gertrude, organize a similar request for wage audits. Their efforts succeeded, and their management agreed to adjust salaries to avoid public disclosure. I realized that my experience was part of a larger systemic problem that needed to be addressed openly. I decided to dedicate my spare time to advising others. The online community I created quickly grew to include thousands of professionals from different sectors. We shared resources, discussed legal strategies, and provided support to individuals who were fighting for fair pay in their respective companies. I was invited to speak at regional conferences and industry events, where I shared my experiences and discussed the importance of transparency in the workplace. I watched as the movement grew, inspiring people to examine their own pay structures and demand the respect they deserved. I realized that the action I took on that Monday morning had created a ripple effect that was changing the way companies treated their employees. A year after Victoria was ousted, she attempted to launch a new consulting firm under a different corporate name. She reached out to several of our former clients and tried to recruit current employees, promising them high starting salaries and partnerships. However, Nicholas contacted me and warned me of her attempts. I decided to publish an anonymous case study based on the audit data I had compiled, changing all names and client details but preserving the exact retention cost management strategy she had used. The article was shared widely within the local technology community, making it impossible for Victoria to secure funding or attract talent for her new venture. Her attempts to rebuild her business failed. 2 years after leaving Victoria's company, I published a book detailing my experience and providing a guide for employees to navigate compensation negotiations. The book became a valuable resource for young professionals. I also started a consulting firm that helps organizations design transparent and equitable pay structures. My revenge was never about destroying the business. It was about forcing an organization to recognize the value of its workers. By refusing to accept exploitation, I had helped create a fairer environment for dozens of people. The truth I left on Victoria's chair had started a transformation that continued to grow, proving that standing up for one's worth can change the industry. Every time I receive a letter from a reader who negotiated a fair salary or resolved a workplace disparity, I am reminded that the risk I took was worthwhile. The personal costs were high, but the lasting impact of that choice has redefined my career and my life.